Sorry, it's extremely slow to load. Okay. So the next part of this morning, the second training of this morning, is going to be about discussing students' learning objective. We here had one goal with this training. Teachers will be able to write effective learning objectives. So I will go through the different theory of writing learning objectives. We'll discuss a bit about Bloom taxonomy, but also how we can check our objectives, making sure they are smart, making sure they follow a simple principle ABCD, and explain the different techniques. And I will also make sure to give you some specific examples that are related to what you will be teaching in the classroom and what the learners will be learning, and also applications of your lesson plans in the classroom. So here we are looking at only an hour training, so from 11:05 to 12:05. And then the Q&A will be from 12:05 to 12:15. We'll have about 10 minutes because we'll be discussing again learning objectives in the afternoon. And then we'll take a short quiz again before our lunch break from 12:30 to 1:30. I would like to remind you that this training is being recorded, so please keep your mic off and your video off during the first hour of this training. So students' learning objectives. You have one objective here, one goal is to learn how to write effective learning objectives. The content of this training. So there are 6 different parts for the training before the practice. The first is simple definitions of what are learning objectives. Then the second point on the agenda is what are we learning? So for example, discussing aims and content of the learning objective. We'll go over Bloom taxonomy and the different Bloom taxonomy that exist. And then also we will only refer to the most recent revised Bloom taxonomy. Then I will show you some examples of how teachers have implemented learning objectives they've written in different level of connectivity. And then we'll look at what is a smart learning objective and how we can use the ABCD method to check our learning objective and all its components. Then we'll have a short practice that you will be doing online. And then after that, again, Q&A and quiz. So before we can discuss learning objectives in curriculum map or in curriculum planning steps is going to be the last thing we do before we start writing our lessons, but it's the last step in the curriculum planning steps. So when we design a curriculum, the first thing we do is start by defining our vision statement and then our aims. So where do we want to be by the end of the program? What do we want our learners to be able to do, to know by the end of the program? Then we divide it, as we could see, in strands and sub-strands to organize this curriculum in something that will make sense to teachers and learners. Make sure that we are covering all the aims as well. In our case, the strand and sub-strands are from the Cambridge program. And then we are going to divide the learning standards into the sub-strands. So those are the statements that are going to decide on what the achievements of a program by the end of each year, each level are going to be. And then the learning outcomes within a unit. So then we specify what are the degree of masteries of a standard in different unit outcomes, which you are going to see presented in each level in each unit outcomes. They are repeated and a lot of them are similar, but at different cognitive level. Beginning of the school year, end of the school year, you will definitely see a huge difference, being able to remember something versus being able to explain something. And then the last is obviously our learning objective, which is what you are going to try to learn how to write. For a lot of you, I understand that you're very familiar with writing learning objectives and writing your own lesson plans. But in the requirements of this program, what is the learning objective that will match our expectations? So all the steps of the curriculum planning already have been done for you, obviously. We talked about the vision statement, the aims, the strand and the substrand definition. We looked at a few learning standards. And on your own, you will look at all the learning standards for the levels you are teaching. And then the unit outcomes are presented in each of the units. Now, curriculum mapping is the process of associating course outcomes with program level learning outcomes and aligning the different elements of courses within a program in a current and purposeful way that is going to enhance student learning. So here, the curriculum map that we are presenting to you is really a visual that is going to show how the curriculum is supposed to flow through the program. It is capturing and recording which learning standards are being addressed and where in the program and how it is going to be addressed, the level of mastery we were discussing. So what is a learning objective? What are the components of a learning objective? So no matter what standards you use, there should be a constant in every lesson, the learning objective. So the learning objectives are the basis of what teachers hope to accomplish in any given lesson. And the counterpart to that is the success criteria. To know if the learning objective was achieved or not is to present a success criteria to which you can assess how the learners have done during the lesson and how the learners can assess themselves how they have done during the lesson to know if you reached your goal or your objective or not. So learning objectives are a specific learning goal coupled with a specific way to measure where students are in meeting that goal. So the components of a student learning objective, usually you have the audience, the actor, so the student. So who is expected to achieve the objective is always a student. You are going to target a specific behavior or performance. So what is the task to be performed by the audience, by the students? It should be observable and measurable. That's why we are referring to Bloom taxonomy, because those are measurable verbs. And then they should refer to action verbs that will describe behaviors. Now, the condition, for example, the condition under which behavior is going to be performed and the degree of mastery is how well the audience is going to perform that behavior, okay? So the learning objectives focus on the purpose of your lesson and subsequent planning. The objectives are also going to give you an outcome and a goal to achieve, so a behavior you want to target in each of your lesson. The objectives are going to be smaller and more digestible than a full standard or unit outcome. They're going to be much more specific. Objectives can help students understand the lesson purpose because you communicate your objective and the success criteria to your students at the beginning of the lesson. Learners should know what they are learning about and what is the goal of the lesson. Combined with assessment, objectives let you know when learning has happened. And the objectives are going to set the foundation for a student-led task or discussion. Remember that this is a student-centered program. So the students are obviously hours whom you have in mind, and any task that you are going to design or activities you are going to do in the classroom are most often student-led tasks and discussion. Now, what are we learning? How to write learning objectives. It is important to intentionally design learning objectives that will meet students' learning needs. So your students are obviously not all at the same level. They do not have the same language skill, the same language ability, because we're not all equal when it comes to a second language, achievement, acquiring skills, but also being able to gain vocabulary, etc. We know that some of our learners benefit from an English environment being created at home, or having a parents who speak English fluently and is speaking to them mostly in English when they're at home. Some students have access to a lot of extracurricular classes and programs that they're joining after school during the weekend, but it's not the case for everyone. So they do not have, obviously, they are not all at the same level. So they do not all have the same needs, because some of the learners that you have in the classroom, and is stating the obvious, will already be able to recognize all of their letters and pronounce all of their sounds. But for some of your learners, it is going to be completely new. So how do you address that? When you look at the standards and decide what should be achieved during the lesson, you will have to identify the needs of your students, but also you have to identify the aim of your lesson. That's very important to get started there. So are the aim of my lesson going to be linguistic or skill or communicative? So when we are talking about a linguistic aim or linguistic aims, we focus on the systems of the language, the grammar, the vocabulary, the pronunciation, and the discourse. If you set a linguistic aim, remember to also state the context in which language is going to be used. So for example, by the end of the lesson, students will be able to understand and use the present simple tense in the context of what they are doing or what they were doing, okay? But if we are, for example, presenting present continuous, so your objective will be able to, by the end of the lesson, students will be able to understand and use the present continuous to talk about what they are doing in the moment. So another example could be, this lesson aims at helping learners to understand and use comparison, to compare and contrast animals or different characters in the story. By the end of this lesson, students will be able to use vocabulary to express their likes or their dislikes. Those are linguistic aims. But you might choose to have a skill aims. So for example, skill aims focus on the systems of language. So your strengths: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. An example of that could be, this lesson aims at helping students develop their reading skills for GIST. So reading for global, and then for global meaning, for example, and specific information in the context of flowers and plants when we are learning about spring. By the end of the lesson, another example of an aim in the skill should be, by the end of the lesson, students will have developed their speaking skills by talking about their last holiday, or holidays they like, they prefer or they like to celebrate with their families. So those are really skill aims. They are targeting specific skills in different strands or sub-strands of the program. You could also decide that your learning objective is going to have a communicative aims. The communicative aims usually help students to develop their communicative competence to be able or better able to use language in real life situation. So for example, you could decide that the objective is going to be by the end of this lesson, students will be better able to talk about their daily routine at school or their daily routine at home, or learners should be able to sequence their daily routine and talk about each part of their routine. Another example could be when we are discussing, community helpers, for example. Your lesson could be helping students to talk about their future plans by understanding different jobs and the different qualities of community helpers. So whatever your aim is going to be, it is going to dictate what strain you're looking at, the skill, the communication, or the linguistic aspects of your lessons. Now, the second thing you will have to think about when you're designing a learning objective is you will have to think about and look at is the lesson, and make sure that what will be taught and the activities plan are going to be aligned with the learning standard. Because we are always referring back to the learning standard, to the unit outcomes. And then you are starting to decide of an aim. But then you have to make sure that when you pick activities, they're aligned with all three: aims, learning standards, and unit outcomes before you start writing your learning objective. Though step 2 and step 3 can happen at the same time, because you could look at unit outcomes and decide of an aim and then pick an activity and then write your learning objective. But you could technically write the learning objective and then pick the activity that will meet that objective. If you want to target specific student needs, it might be easier to decide of what the learning objective is and then decide of what the activity should be. So when we are, trying or deciding how to write our learning objectives, we also have to think about the learning activities, but we should never forget the assessment. There is a part of each lesson where an assessment is necessary to be able to measure the progress of the learners. So here, this magic triangle, which I'm sure for anyone who has taken courses in education would be a very familiar concept, represents the relationship between the learning objectives, the learning activities you will pick and implement in the classroom, and the assessments you will conduct within the lesson, during the lesson, throughout the lesson. If these three components are interdependent, congruent, they achieve an exact match with the standard, then teaching and learning is enhanced. Because if you keep track of your learners' progress, of your learners' miss as well, then you should be able to always refer to that, and it will help you write your next learning objective and then design better your next activities. And that's where differentiation is going to take place and really support every single learner in your classroom. So if we take each element of the magic triangle separately, we could think about what we should consider when writing learning objectives. So when you're writing learning objectives, and we will see that in detail very soon, they should be specific. They should target specific skills, specific aims, but they also should be measurable and behavior-based outcomes. Because if you want to be able to conduct an assessment, you should know exactly what is the behavior the learners should show, display, or be able to do in the classroom. When we look at another component of the magic triangle, the learning activities, something to remember is that learning activities are chosen to foster student learning towards meeting the objectives. That will always help you to pick the activities well, but it could also be, like we said, the opposite. You pick the activities and make sure they fit the objectives, and then you write your objective. The last component of the magic triangle is the assessment. So your course assessments accurately measure whether students are achieving the learning objectives. That's why you are writing not just learning objective, but also success criteria, which is something we'll be discussing this afternoon. Talking about Bloom taxonomy, it is a very vast subject, and obviously you have already received some trainings during your years learning about education, or when you got, your degree, or when you get your license as well. But it's a very important one. There are different, obviously, taxonomy you could refer to. We chose to focus mostly on Bloom taxonomy because we think it's a good toolbox for teachers, even in kindergarten, to use and classify and organize learning objectives and to make sure that they are working towards the proper level of cognitivity to support their learners to achieve the standard and to progress towards what we want them to know or to be able to do in primary. So the domains of learning, Bloom taxonomy, can be categorized as affective attitude, psychomotor is going to be skills, and then cognitive is going to be knowledge. So here in our ESL program, we are going to focus on the domain of learning, which is cognitive, so knowledge. We are not really targeting any in the skill domain of learning because it's more related to movement and physical skills, which is going to be done in the Vietnamese program. We do have some attitudes, for example, or affective learning standards, like taking turns, listening to others when they are speaking, being able to ask for help, etc. So related to their emotions and their feelings, and being able to bring them on how they feel appropriately. So we are going to refer sometimes to that domain of learning, the domain of learning, but it is really few in our program in kindergarten. There is a specific learning area in kindergarten done and taught in Vietnamese, which is a social emotional learning, and they will refer to that domain of learning. But still, you will see, and I'm sure you can identify easily some standards that will belong to the domain of learning, affective domain of learning. So for Bloom taxonomy, still looking at the different domain of learning here. The starting point of any planning process should be the consideration of the level of the students, where they are at, and that's why assessment is so important, to know where to get, how to get there next. So Bloom taxonomy is going to provide a very convenient, in our opinion, framework within which to begin this process, okay? So when creating objectives, you can move from the simple to complex, from the concrete to abstract, according to the ability of your students through reference to the taxonomy. So for example, we know that learners in kindergarten very often have or are at a concrete level of representation. They need objects. They need to be able to physically manipulate objects to understand, convey meaning, and being able to absorb meaning and understand it, and then communicate. So it is quite important for us to be in an understanding level, for example, in their cognitive development when we are introduced tasks and activities. Now, symbolic level or abstract level is often not reached in kindergarten. It's going to be reached later in their grade for some skills and some cognitive activities in grade 1 and grade 2, grade 3, etc. So here I'm presenting a list of action verbs separated by different domain of learning. We are going to avoid having more than one action verb for each level of learning, obviously, to make sure that it's also a verb that can't be measured. For example, understand. We all understand that there are different behaviors learners could show to tell us that they understood the instruction, that they understood what they had to do, that they understood the question. But it is quite difficult to be able to measure a verb like understand. So instead of using the verb understanding, or the learners will be able to understand or can understand in your lesson objectives, which is a very vague verb, we'll be using different verbs such as completing. Completing, for example, a worksheet means they listened to the instruction, they understood the instruction, they can complete it. That's the behavior you can measure. Being able to identify 5 colors, pointing to 5 colors, 5 different colors that are spoken out loud. Being able to recognize. Those are specific verbs. Same, for example, in the attitude domain of learning. So you could look at different verbs like accepting, agreeing, allowing, analyzing, approving, assessing, believing, choosing, etc. And you will see that it's, again, a behavior that is easily measurable. So when we are looking at our, for example, objective in NEMO class related to the attitude domain of learning, which will be observing and attempting to engage in conversation. A child that is observing others is often looking at them, interacting, directing their body towards others. During play, if they are turning their back, you know that they are not interested in joining the conversation. Those are behaviors that you can easily measure, that you can, very easily observe. So that's what you want to write in your objective, because you will easily be able to tell whether or not it happened. In the cognitive domain of learning, so we have verbs such as comparing, defining, describing, designating, discovering, distinguishing, explaining, identifying, etc. You'll see that they are already picked in the standard, the unit outcome, and the lesson outcome for each of your units. But it does not mean that the level of your students will match the cognitive level that we picked for the lesson outcome or for the unit outcome. So you might have to rethink it and pick another measurable verb. Skills, I won't really spend any time on it because we all know that we won't be referring to it in writing our objectives. Now, looking at the pyramid here of Bloom taxonomy for the specific cognitive level of a domain of learning. So the cognitive domain, Bloom taxonomy, is based on the principle that learning should be structured from easy to difficult. You may also know that some verbs and phrases will work at more than one level because they're repeated from one level to another. And they refer to the stated aim of each level to assess if the purpose is what is the purpose in that particular context. So a useful way to employ like the verb list is to incorporate them into your learning objectives, for example, in different lessons. So you can ask yourself at different levels of, cognitive understanding here and achievements. For example, in the remembering level, can the students recall or remember the information? And then what behavior could show you that they are remembering this knowledge? So for example, being able to list out colors, being able to recalling a short poem. It's just at the remembering stage, okay? Now, if you move to the next stage in the same standard, which is going to be understanding, the question to ask yourself is, can the students comprehend information and grasp its meaning? Different verbs to be able to measure their understanding here is classifying information, sorting information into different categories, describing a routine, describing an event, being able to discuss a topic, and also giving some a certain level of details when you are entering the conversation. Being able to explain something, identifying something, recognizing something, or predicting something. The next level is applying. So I remember knowledge, I can understand that knowledge, and now I'm trying to apply it in a situation that is similar to the context in which I learned it or different. Can the students use the information in a new way to solve problems? That's the question you should ask yourself. Then some matching verbs here will be how to show, for example, that knowledge, demonstrate knowledge, dramatize when they are role playing, being able to illustrate it, predict it, interpret it, operate, schedule, solve, use, etc. Very often, you will find for most of the levels from preschool, so age 3 to age 6, that we are going to stay in the first three levels here. So remembering, understanding, and applying. A few of our standards and unit outcomes are going to be in the fourth level here, which is analyzing, but there are really a few. Because our learners are still very young, a lot of the knowledge they are learning is new and has to be repeated for it to go through the different level of understanding here. So remembering and then understanding and then applying. So by the time we reach the applying level, most of the learners will progress to primary. But still, you could be asking yourself, for example, if you are in the analyzing level, can the students distinguish between the different parts? And there are different verbs that you could be using to measure that behavior, being able to compare, contrast, differentiate, distinguish, etc. The next level, cognitive level, is evaluating. So your question is, can the student justify a stand or a decision? And remember how you asked me earlier in the listening strands and also in the reading strands, there was an aim which was following a line of argument from stage 6. So it's being able to, understand, being able to apply, analyze, and also evaluate a line of argument. That is done much later, again, in grade 5. And when we reach the last cognitive level, which is creating, that is the higher thinking level, the question you could ask yourself is, can the students create a new product or point of view? So we actually have a few tasks related to standards that are at that level, where the learner should be able to, for example, create their own play or create or write their own song. So there are different verbs to target and measure that behavior. So for example, being able to create something, design a slideshow, being able to write, develop, formulate, reorganize. So depending on the context and the level of the students and the age group you are teaching, you will find that different levels of thinking will apply. I want to give you a few examples of tasks or activities you will find in the program that will apply the same knowledge from the remembering level to the creating level of thinking. Okay, so here, obviously, questions to ask yourself before writing students' learning objectives. So what do you want your students to be able to do? Really think about, if it's knowledge, if it's attitude, what are the aims of your learning objective? Is it communication? Is it linguistic? Is it going to be skill-based? How can they demonstrate that they meet those requirements? Make sure you pick the right verb, the right behavior, and that it is measurable. And how the students' learning objectives of the lesson align with the learning standards and the unit outcomes. I always go back to that. At first, it's a bit daunting as a task because it takes some time to make sure first, when you read the standard, when you read the outcomes, you actually understand what it means before you can write your own objective. But when you go through it after some time, I would say a month of practice, 2 months of practice, if you take the time to do it right, it will come naturally and it's much easier after some time. So the examples here for each level of thinking, we are looking at first remembering, so story sequencing, understanding, retelling a story, applying a drama play, analyzing, the life cycle of a butterfly. In the story, for example, there's some fiction, but there is also some non-fictional facts. For example, the life cycle of the butterfly is quite well represented in the Very Hungry Caterpillar. So they can analyze the story through the eyes of science and what they can learn and facts they can learn in that story. Evaluating. What is the caterpillar diet? Does it match what is, shown in the story? Do you really think that caterpillars can find lollipops in nature and can actually eat through a lollipop, or are even interested in eating through a lollipop? And creating. You are going to draw life cycle diagram, for example, to show that you remember the fact, you understood the fact. You will be able to apply whatever you have learned, analyze what you have learned, and evaluate it, what was true, what was not true, for example, in a story. Looking at it in detail. So the first thinking level being remembering, we were discussing a story sequencing. So students will be able to match the beginning, the middle, and the ending of a story by rearranging the scrambled story scenes here on their matching mat. So it's being able to remember what happened in the story and put it in a certain order. The second level of thinking, remember, it's understanding. The learners will be able to retell the story. They will be able to retell the main idea. They identify the main events in the story, and they are able to retell those in their own words, obviously, sometimes supported in using the story map, but still in their own words. The next level of thinking is going to be a task on drama play, because we want them to be able to apply what they have learned. So the students will be able to act out the story using different props. Often it's props that you are going to provide to them, and not necessarily props that they are going to provide themselves, so they are going to design themselves, because then we'll be in a different level of cognitivity here. Then the learners will be able to analyze, for example, the content of a story. So the life cycle of a butterfly, students will be able to differentiate between the stages of the life cycle of a butterfly using the story illustrations. So does it match what we know about the life cycle of a butterfly? What is presented in the story? Is the first stage, for example, in the life cycle, the egg, and then it turns into a caterpillar, then a chrysalis, then a butterfly? Does it actually matches what you know of the life cycle of a butterfly? We're going to analyze it. We're going to compare. We're going to differentiate between what we know and what we have read in the story or seen in the story. The next level, we are going to discuss caterpillar diets. We're going to evaluate the content of the story. Students will be able to evaluate whether, food is healthy, what food is healthy, and what food is unhealthy in the story based on the caterpillar feeling, and being able to, tell you what happened to the caterpillar. Do they actually eat junk food? Can they find junk food in nature? All those things, all those answers can be found through research as well, which is a good opportunity for you to teach the children how to research information. The next level of thinking is creating. So the learners, the objective here in the caterpillar life cycle activity, students will be able to recreate the caterpillar's life cycle using art supplies available to them and labeling the 4 stages of the life cycle, namely egg, caterpillar, chrysalis, or cocoon, and butterfly. So I hope that those different examples are helping you understand how we'll be writing good learning objectives in different level of thinking according to the Bloom taxonomy. And again, we are referring mostly to the cognitive domain here. Now, I also wanted to discuss, what are the qualities of a good learning objectives. We want the learning objectives to be smart. We discussed that a few times throughout this training, but really, what does it mean? So the objectives should be smart because S will stand for specific. They should be stated clearly and specifically. They also should be measurable. We have said that throughout the training often. It has to be a measurable verb because you should be able to measure it through assessment and evaluation. So A stands for acceptable. Is the level of learning achievable? Should I differentiate my learning objectives because I have very low level in my classroom and I have very high level in my classrooms? Are the learning objectives that I decided for this lesson, written for this lesson, acceptable for all my learners? R is going to stand for realistic. Are the learning objective relevant in relation to the outcomes? Okay. Are they going to be realistic in the fact that, for example, I need to achieve them in one lesson? May I apply whatever learning objective you think about? Can it be done in one lesson? Should I do it over 3 lessons? Should I repeat it? Do I need to repeat it for certain learners, but not all learners? And then the T is going to stand for time bound. Can they be achieved within the time available? Very important for you to also decide if that behavior is going to be measured and is going to be achieved over several lessons or one lesson. Those are SMART objectives. One way to also check if you meet all of the requirement when writing your own objective is to use the ABCD method. It includes 4 pieces. A stands for audience, B for behavior, C for condition, and D for degree of mastery, which is referring again to your Bloom taxonomy verbs. For everyone, you have to identify and label the components. So for example, the audience, we discussed that. Are the children or the students? It can be just a group of learners as well. So for example, it could be your high ability group or your low ability group. The behavior. What the participants, in this case, the students, are going to do differently. So what is your action verb, your behavior, what you intend to measure, what the learners can do, what knowledge, etc. The condition. The condition under which the behavior is to be performed. What are the tools, the materials, or the environment required for the learners to be able to show that behavior, to be able to practice that behavior, to be able to achieve that behavior? Now, the degree of mastery, quite important to think about it, because obviously you are going to decide how many times you will repeat this objective. So if it's the first time you're presenting this objective and it's an intro to something, well, there is a very good chance it's not going to be mastered by the end of the lesson. So having clear expectations on the degree of mastery that the children should be at, for example, or you are expecting by the end of a lesson is helping you for your assessment, is helping you to define your next learning objective as well. So degree of mastery, the criterion for acceptable performance, speed, accuracy, and quality. Examples of learning objectives that are going to meet all criteria in the ABCD method. So again, A is for audience. Here it is going to be a red font, and then B for behavior in green, C for condition in blue, and D for degree in yellow. So the first example of this is children will be able to recall at least 3 colors in the story. The audience here you see is not really changing. It's always children or students, but the behavior is quite clear, being able to recall. And then the degree of mastery. Let's say you are going to teach them to recognize 5 colors, but you are expecting, because it's only their first lesson, for them to recall and list 3 colors. Okay, that's your minimum, but some of them will be able to recall at least 5 colors. And then the condition. The colors are going to be presented in certain materials, in this case, through a story. So they have to recall at least three colors that were presented throughout the story. Another example is children will be able to describe the rainbow in pair. The condition here is changed. It's just about the environment of the students that are going to be involved in the task or how they're going to be involved in the task. So audience still your children, and then the behavior is describing. So describing here could be even more specific because you're saying the rainbow, but it could be the colors of the rainbow, for example. They could be describing the shapes of the rainbow. They could be describing the order of the color, the sequencing of the rainbow, etc., etc. And they're going to do that in pair, which is your condition, and the degree is the rainbow. So you are expecting all colors, all shapes, no matter, again, depending on what you're using as a material or media, you are expecting the whole rainbow to be described. So they should not be forgetting any details in what you are showing in your picture. Another objective here, the third presented, is given the weather spinner. Students will be able to name 4 kinds of weather. So the condition is given the weather spinner. You are deciding what materials the learners are going to use in order to show that behavior. So name, very easily measured, and then 4 kinds of weather. That's your level of your degree of mastery. You know that there were 4 kinds of weather presented on the spinner, and they should be able to name all 4 kinds of weather. The last one, children will be able to identify CVC, especially in the ED family, CVC words in the worksheet by blending and reading them. So your learners here are going to learn their phonics, but they are specifically learning 2 phonemes, ed. So put together, it's the ed family. Identify being your behavior, meaning they can identify specifically ed's word family, and in the worksheet is your condition. So it's the material that you chose for the children to be able to demonstrate that behavior. Okay? So we have a bit of a practice here. It really won't take long, but we are going to work in that file for some time. So the idea is for you to be able to go to the link that I put at the bottom of the slide here. I'm going to text it in the chat box as well. And to just find the content of the first unit in Alvin Advanced specific framework. It's the welcome unit. It's the first one you are going to teach. You're going to copy the weekly lesson planner tab. I will show you all those tabs. You will enter your team's name. You do not have to work individually. If you work in team of, teachers in your campus, that's fine too. You can just put your team's name. If you want to work individually, just put your own name. Start writing your lesson plan, okay? But we will focus only on learning objectives in the next training, okay? So the only task you have to do right now is to create your own tab for your weekly lesson planner and enter your team's name. Let me just text you the link, but before that, I will show you exactly what it looks like. This is the lesson plan template we'll be discussing this afternoon, okay? Give me a sec, okay. You can see the tabs at the bottom of the screen. It's a bit hidden. Give it a second. Okay. So for example, I created one for Team Gardenia. You will click on the letter arrow here, and I want you to duplicate, okay, the tab and retitle it. So for example, Miss New. And I don't know, let's say you are from T36, okay? So if you work individually, just type in your name and your campus. If you work in groups, just type the name of your team which should be your campus really. And it can be team, for example, Alvin team Gardenia. Okay. You duplicate, remember, the template. For now, that's the only step I want you to do, and read through the first unit. This is the welcome unit for Alvin Advanced. Here, we are specifying the number of the unit, so that's unit welcome. The unit description. The unit description is giving you some like a summary of information about the unit. So for example, what are really the specific topics in the units? It's classroom language, direction, school supplies, phonics, numbers and colors, shapes and size. The timeline for the unit. So in this case, it's going to be 2 to 3 weeks because we are starting midweek, for example. So obviously it's longer than 2 weeks, but not exactly 3 weeks. Then a summary of the units. The students should learn how to greet people when they enter and leave the room, etc., etc. And at the end, I specify the materials you will need for this unit, to teach this unit, something you should either order or collect in different classroom or in your office. Here we specify what is the theme, vocab, and grammar. So you have all the vocabulary listed and sorted, and then all the grammar points here. And then the standards. The standards are also sorted by strands. So listening, speaking, writing, reading, use of English. The unit outcomes are also sorted same at the standard, and you will see it's a one-on-one match. Okay, so for example, here the standards is listening for detail. The first standard is understand with little or no support a short sequence of familiar instructions. The outcome is follow with little support, short instruction to participate in an activity. Then here, the lesson content knowledge is going to be divided. So for example, for your first, for the first few lessons here, this description is the learners in these lessons will be able to introduce themselves and other learners. They should be able to share personal information. You have 5 periods to achieve these lesson outcomes and to teach this content knowledge. So here as specified are the standards and unit outcomes. And what are your lesson outcomes? What the learners should be able to do by the end of the lessons. A period is 1 lesson, okay? Yeah, 30 minutes per period. So for example, here learners can introduce themselves. Learners can ask a friend and repeat his or her name and how old he or she is. Learners can say how they feel. Learners can ask a friend how he or she feels. Learners can use present simple forms to give personal information. So these lesson outcomes will be divided into 4 different periods. Some will be repeated in some different periods. And then this is on what you're going to base the writing of your learning objectives, okay? So 2 things for you to do. I'm going to send you the link. Just give me a sec. Okay. In the chat box, I'm sending you the link to this document. Everyone should click on it. Okay, should click on it, duplicate the tab to either name it with the team name, specifying age group and campus, or your name and your campus if you want to work individually. We are going to use this file for the next 2 days quite often, okay? And then the last thing is for you to read the welcome unit, okay? You will have plenty of time to do it again this afternoon. If you just want to have a quick look, at minimum right now, you should create your tab with the sample of your lesson plan template. Okay, you're quite fast. Let's give each other 2 minutes to do this. 2, 3 minutes. There are still a few people working in the file, but I think we can still move on to our Q&A in case anyone who is done has a question. Again, you can type your question or feel free to turn on your mic and just share it with everyone. Let's give each other a few minutes to think of any questions and go back to your notes if you need to. If not, we'll just move on to the quiz. It will give everyone an extra few minutes to finish creating their lesson planner. everyone must be hungry already, so you have no questions. If anything pops up, you can just text in the chat box. But I guess I will let everyone now. And when you are done, you can just leave for lunch. I will take attendance this afternoon after the last training. Let me just. This is the QR code for the next quiz about this topic of student learning objective. And I will also text the, give me a second, text the link in the chat box. The link for this quiz on student learning objective is in the chat box. You should be able to see the QR code on your screen. Please do scan it, complete the quiz. When you're done, you're on your lunch break until 1:30. So I want to see everyone back at 1:30.